All right, we are going to get started. Come on, find your seat. Come on, come on. Did you grab the notes? Okay. Better run. Lord, I pray that by the power of your Holy Spirit, our minds would be renewed tonight. By the power of your Holy Spirit, you would come and reveal truth to us. You would draw us closer to you because you are the truth. So as we get closer to truth, we're actually drawing nearer to the Lord himself. Lord, I pray that you would soften our hearts tonight, that you would work in us the very fruit of the Spirit, which consists of love and goodness. That we might learn, Lord, by your leading, how to be true agents of justice in this world. Starting, Lord, with our own lives, our own families, our own small communities we find ourselves a part of, branching out, God, into world transformation through the power of your Spirit and the power of your church. God, I pray that you'd help us, Lord, to comprehend, to understand tonight, that you would help us to connect the dots, and that you'd be glorified in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we are starting social justice tonight. We will only be doing 2 weeks of this one because we did miss 1 week due to sickness, unfortunately. We've made the decision not to extend this into July because as a church we have other things that need to be focused on in July. So we are only doing 2 weeks on social justice. And I wrestled with this one because in some ways this is actually the most complex of all 3 of our topics. We started with LGBTQ issues, we went into abortion, and now we're ending with social justice. And this honestly, in many ways, is the most complex issue of all of them. So I kind of thought, how are we going to pare this down? How are we going to make this work in just 2 weeks? I'm going to do my best, okay? I want you to be asking questions. I want you to be probing a little bit because I was praying that the Lord would help us connect the dots because there might be some meat that's lost in translation and it doesn't quite bridge it for you, right? It doesn't quite take you from A to Z. And so you might need to ask some of those questions that I'm kind of blind to that can help bring some extra clarity or whatever. But basically, we're going to be getting rid of 2 things. We're going to be getting rid of going over kind of the broader historical context, especially when it comes to the biblical data. We're gonna not cover kind of the historical context in like ancient Near East documents as well as time of Christ things. We will be talking about the Bible. That'll be today, but we're going to get rid of that kind of historical context bit. And then we're also going to get rid of, I was going to do kind of a case study where I actually walk us through one instance of something being promoted today as social justice. And I was going to kind of systematically walk us through it and try to show us how all these dots connect. We're not going to do that anymore. So you're going to have to try to connect the dots a little bit more than normal. So if you have questions, if you want to probe a little bit more or whatever, feel free to do so. Okay? Does that sound all right? All right, let's dive in then. We're going to start, I said we're not going to do like deep historical context when it comes to Bible stuff, but we are going to do a little bit of history tonight. So we're asking the question, just what is social justice? right? What is social justice? Let's just take a crack at it, okay? Who wants to try to give a quick definition? All right?
Maybe it's, you're trying to, if it was in its best form, everybody would get the same kind of justice, the whole society would.
Okay. What do you mean by same kind of justice? You mean like treated fairly?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
The same way, where the issues are.
Sure. So treated fairly in society is kind of what you would say? Okay. Someone else? Or did Kate nail it and we're just good? You guys can go home. Yay, we're done. Kate summarized it. I didn't even need 2 weeks. We're fine. It's all done. Yeah, Brenda.
I don't know, there's a lot of, talk about social justice, but I feel like it's more geared towards social justice for certain people groups
Okay.
or minorities that maybe have suffered prejudice or racism and that.
Okay, so you've noticed that social justice tends to be framed around minority groups? Yep, that tends to be true, for sure. Anything else someone wants to add or give as a thought?
Well, it's just interesting when our block published these signs, and now it's not just this one social justice, but now it's nurses. We have a variety of signs. All these issues. It's just
So there's this trend in our society called virtue signaling, right? Where you kind of you throw up, a company might release a short statement after some injustice occurs. George Floyd is killed, and Target released. I don't actually know if they did or what they said or whatever. I'm just giving out a random example, made up example. George Floyd is killed. Target releases a statement. Black Lives Matter or something like that. Okay, that kind of like we just want to signal and show that we're virtuous people that are against injustice, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything about it, or so there tends to be a lot of kind of this public solidarity that's given, especially on social media, right? Put up your profile pic if you're supporting Ukraine or whatever, but then it's like, how many of those people are actually supporting Ukraine in any meaningful way? Things like that. That's called virtue signaling. Yeah. Sure, you see some of that. And I certainly don't want to give the impression that anyone who makes a public statement like that is only virtue signaling. They might truly be helping people in some fashion. So I'm not trying to prejudge. I'm just saying we know that is certainly occurring today. It's trendy to be for justice. Paul.
So where does all this trying to make amends with the past for past
Reparations?
sins, let's say, yeah,
Reparations? Yeah.
like changing names of schools and
Sure.
city parks and
Sure.
lakes, and is that all under social justice?
It would, yeah, I think the people that are promoting it would call it social justice. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. For sure. Here's the thing about this one, you guys. Especially because I'm omitting kind of the case study portion of this. We aren't going to be going into the specific examples of social justice in society. So you're going to have to do a lot of the thinking on your own. You're going to have to connect the dots on your own. But you've been through 2 sections so far, so I believe in you. I know you can do it. But yeah, we're not going to necessarily go down a master list and say, this is good, this is bad, this is good, we're not going to do that, right? We just don't have the ability, and sometimes it's not actually clear, is this good or is this bad? It's just people have different opinions, and that's okay, right? All right, let's continue on. So let's give a little bit of context. Let's give some history here, okay? And yes, we are going to start with conservatism's arch nemesis, Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx. Here's this dude right here, 19th century German philosopher. He is obviously widely known for the Communist Manifesto. He's widely known for creating the communist governmental perspective, right? And being the instigator of all the communist regimes we have in the world, or had in the world. The USSR being one of them that no longer exists, but is still kind of exerting some influence on some neighbors that don't appreciate it too much. Obviously socialism comes out of Karl Marx's ideas. Socialism is slightly different than communism. At least that's what we're told. We'll see, I guess, if socialism is really different than communism. But anyway, Karl Marx, right? He came up with this kind of fundamental idea called conflict theory, okay? Conflict theory. And what he proposed was that all inequity, all inequality, all disparity of position, so like class systems, things like that, class systems were a result of competition or conflict in the world. So he viewed that all society is structured around competition for limited resources. Limited resources like wealth, like safety and security, like fill in the blank, natural resources, right? All this kind of stuff. That all of society is structured in these governments around the world around conflict. And it's due to this conflict that someone eventually gets the upper hand over another. And what results then is you have class systems that form, namely the oppressor and the oppressed. Okay? So you've heard of the bourgeoisie, right? And the proletariat. If you took 10th grade history class, like you've heard of this, right? The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So this idea that Karl Marx had that class systems inevitably form in these conflict-driven societies. He particularly had a beef with capitalism, right? Like the free market, competition, all of this in economics. And that inevitably what occurs is these class systems develop, and you have those who have theirs, the bourgeoisie, the oppressor, and you have those who don't get anything, who eat the crumbs off the table, okay, the proletariat, the oppressed. And he said, I want to think of a new way of doing government. I want to think a new way of doing society, okay? A new way. I want to pave a new road so that these class systems and these inequities, these inequalities, no longer exist in society. And he came up with the Communist Manifesto. He came up with the idea of communism, where instead of some people, the haves and the have-nots, instead of the haves owning the means of production, in his day, in his time, he's predominantly thinking about like factories, right? Instead of the haves owning the means of production and then paying these laborers, pennies on the dollar to have them work to the bone 14-hour days or whatever. Instead of that, he says, no, all people should own the means of production equally. All people should own the means of production equally. What that would mean then is that we all have everything we need. We all get resources. We all function in an equilibrium society where everyone is just kind of like, it's almost like this paradise view, right? It's like this idyllic, like we're all sharing all of our resources. We all own the means of production, and everyone's happy because they all have, there's no have-nots. Everyone has by owning the means of production, okay? Now, he recognized, he wasn't an idiot, okay? Marx wasn't an idiot. He recognized there's no government on the planet that's going to just willingly do this. And again, he was mainly thinking of these new kind of liberal governments popping up in the modernist age with these democratic and capitalist ideals. And he's kind of taking aim at these capitalist societies. And he's going, like, no government's going to willingly do this because the haves, the bourgeoisie, will never give up their power. Right? So he says the only way for this to occur, for this paradise, for this idyllic world to occur, is for the proletariat to rise up in violent revolution and overthrow their oppressors. Okay? The proletariat revolution. Overthrow their oppressors. And that once that occurs, the government, which is now led by the working class, which has now been overtaken by the working class, they will now distribute equally the means of production to all people. Okay, but this never works, does it? What happens? Every single time this has been enacted in society, it has led to totalitarianism, because the people who lead the revolutions do not give up their power. They become dictators, right? So you have the ideas of Karl Marx leading to 100 million people in the 20th century being killed. You have almost 1 billion people being in some way enslaved, like truly oppressed, right? In 1 century, in 100 years from his ideas, basically. You have the communist regimes of the 20th century rise to power and just wreak havoc in the world. Okay. Obviously, that wasn't his intention. Like, that's not what he wanted. That's not what he anticipated. He thought once the working class has power, they'll redistribute equitably, and everyone will be able to live in a millennial kingdom, kind of an idea, right? And that doesn't happen. Okay, so that's Marxism. Socialism comes out of Marxism as basically a way of saying we need to socialize. Certain things in society must be communal, must be socialized, like Marx believed. But other things inevitably must remain capitalistic, must have, there are certain elements of society that must be capitalistic, right? And so that kind of somewhat marriage of the two is what we call socialism, okay? And that's a hot button topic today, right? And we have socialistic things in our nation, right? Public schools is socialism. Public schools is we all own the schools through our tax-paying money. We all own the schools, and so then we all have equal access to these school systems. We can all send our kids to them because we all own schools. So that's socialism at play in the United States, right? There's been a lot since Obama, all the talk of socialized health care and all of this. You know, do we want the government basically to distribute health care, or do we want health care to be privatized and up to the competition inherent in capitalistic societies? Right. So that's socialism, where some aspects of society are socialized and others are left to capital means, or capitalist free market economy. But Marxism is the hard and fast communism we see in like Russia or with Pol Pot, or anyway.
What about employee-owned businesses? Would that be a form of socialism?
Employee-owned businesses. You mean like where employees own? Yeah. As long... I'm not like, okay, so I'm not an economic expert by any means, all right? I'm not trying to pretend I am. We're going kind of a different direction with this tonight, so I'm not pretending to be like an expert on economics or anything. I think if a free market individual who started a company freely chose to make it an employee-owned business, I don't think that would be considered socialism. Socialism is more when the government, when the state has greater control over the thing itself. But if like an individual just decides, like a co-op or something, that's not true socialism, right?
What about organized religion?
Yeah. Actually, we'll get into the next one here, okay? Cultural hegemony. Any other questions or thoughts on Karl Marx? No, no, I don't think so. I mean, the reality is he didn't see the fruits of his ideas come to pass in his life. They were still ideas when he died. So, okay, cultural hegemony. So, a follow-up to Karl Marx is Antonio Gramsci. This is now an early 20th, like 1930s, okay? 20th century Italian Marxist philosopher. He was basically asking the question, so he lived in fascist Italy, right? Benito Mussolini. He lived in fascist Italy, so communism is far, far left, fascism is far, far right on the scale, right? So he lived in fascist Italy, and so he was frustrated. He also was imprisoned for many years until he died. So, like, you know, he was fed up with the far right and everything, and he was asking the question, why haven't we seen the proletariat revolutions? Karl Marx prophesied, right, that we would see the proletariat be so fed up and so disillusioned with capitalism that they would rise up all over the world and start fighting their oppressors. But we don't actually see that. Why not? Why hasn't it happened? And so Antonio Gramsci is asking this question, and basically he came to this idea that oppressors, or the bourgeoisie, maintain the status quo through cultural institutions. So, in other words, the oppressed are actually voluntarily oppressed. They don't know they're oppressed. They might have an inclination that they are, but they are oppressed voluntarily because of the cultural institutions in society that keep them in their place. Okay, so these are things like cultural stories or folklore, pop culture, you know, the trending stuff of the day, and even religion. That these kind of cultural institutions and cultural influences keep the proletariat class in a state of like almost drunken oppression, where they're oppressed but they don't really care because they are almost cyclically supportive of their own oppression. They're fine with it. So he's trying to answer, why hasn't the proletariat rised up in all these capitalist societies and thrown everybody off? Why hasn't this happened? And so he comes to this idea that they must be willingly oppressed through this indoctrination of their culture. Does that make sense? Questions or thoughts there? This is called cultural hegemony. So the hegemonic or the status quo culture keeps people in a position of oppression. And they don't know how to break out of it because they are basically okay with it through the narratives of their culture. Any thoughts or questions on this one? Yeah.
I don't know where this fits in, but like when there was looting and things in Minneapolis,
Yeah.
wasn't that kind of like the proletariat having somewhat of a revolt?
Maybe. We'll get there.
Stealing from the loot.
Yeah, maybe. We'll get there. We'll get there. I'm glad you're trying to connect the dots, though. That's exactly what I asked you to do. Please connect the dots. Yeah. Okay. The next thought line, critical theory. Okay. Critical theory is a theory that was developed by a group of Marxists who basically they were influenced by the ideas of Gramsci now, who's saying that this cultural hegemony is keeping the oppressed in their place. And So they basically go, okay, how do we overturn the cultural hegemony? How do we overturn these systems and institutions of oppression that keep people in their place in society? So this group of Marxists went back to the drawing board at a school called the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany. And they started within that institute something called the Frankfurt School. It still exists to this day. Frankfurt School for Critical Theory. They began this, and they got together and they went to the drawing board and they're developing this idea. And what they basically came to was that they must identify the underlying assumptions in social life that keep people in this oppressed false consciousness. So it's almost like the Matrix, right? Like the Matrix has been pulled over the eyes of the oppressed, and we need to go in and disrupt these underlying assumptions that keep people hooked into the Matrix, right? That keep people in this state of oppression. So their main role as critical theorists is to criticize society's infrastructure and institutions in order to facilitate political revolution. This is the goal of critical theory, to criticize society's institutions and underlying assumptions in order to facilitate political revolution. And we're not talking about reform. We're not talking about small changes or adjustments. We're talking about Marxist revolution. It doesn't have to be violent per se, but it is looking to overthrow the status quo. Not reform it, but to completely change it. Okay? Criticize society's infrastructure and institutions in order to facilitate political revolution. The idea of critical theory is that social problems, so pick a social issue, pick a social problem, right? Social problems are primarily due to these assumptions and institutions, not due to people or individuals. So, again, how are we, think about this, okay? You gotta step back, you gotta think about this a little bit. How is this all framed? This is all framed as there are oppressors and oppressed. There are haves and have-nots, okay? Those who have not because they are oppressed. And they're oppressed primarily through society's institutions and cultural hegemony. It's cultural narrative. It's cultural assumptions. And so they need to, people who are critical theorists, who are activists in this, need to criticize all of these institutions and assumptions. Because the reason there's inequality, the reason there is inequity, equity is a buzzword, we'll talk about that in a second. The reason there is inequity, the reason that some people do well and some people don't, is because of this institutionalized oppression. Okay? So social problems are primarily due to these assumptions and institutions, not to individuals. Questions or thoughts? I'll keep trying to, as we keep going along, I'll try to connect the dots for you, okay? But questions or thoughts on that? Critical theory. Yes. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. So has anyone in here read White Fragility? Okay. So in White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo, she says, it's the number one book on this topic of racism in America since the death of George Floyd. Like, this has been the number one book since, for the last 2 years. Okay. Robin DiAngelo, she says in White Fragility, she says that racism is not prejudice or discrimination. Racism is institutionalized systems of oppression. She redefines what racism is. She redefines it. What we have always defined racism as is discrimination or prejudice based on skin color. I would say based on race, but race is a construct. That's not a real thing. There's no scientific thing called race. There's one race, it's the human race, okay? So it's prejudice and discrimination based on skin color. That's how we've always understood racism to be, right? But the narrative has changed. In White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo says that racism is not prejudice or discrimination based on skin color. It is institutionalized forces of oppression, such as the police. Okay? The police, the claim would be that the police are out to get black men. Right? That's like the main kind of thing. They're out to get black men. So it's not about an individual, whether they are prejudiced or discriminatory. It's the systems, the infrastructures, and the hegemonic cultural ideas that keep people in a place of oppression. Okay, yeah.
That's what I don't understand, is calling like an institution or saying, oh, so all police are racist because they're police officers. I don't understand that.
So, again, according to Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility, racism is not about having a personal bias toward black people or even toward white people or Asian people or whatever. It's not about having a personal bias toward them. Racism is upholding, more precisely, doing nothing to overturn institutions of injustice. So if you are not seeking to defund the police, because again, it's not reform, it's revolution, right? If you're not seeking to defund the police, you are a racist. Because you're upholding, it has nothing to do with whether you're married to a black man, right? You're married to a black man. But that wouldn't matter. It doesn't matter, according to critical theory. Because it's not about whether you have a personal discriminatory bias or prejudice against black people. You obviously don't. Okay? You obviously don't. But if you're unwilling to actively tear down the institutions that keep black people in oppression, and according to them that would be something like the police, that is what makes you a racist. Well, that's what we're trying to figure out. That's what we're trying to figure out. So again, understand too, these ideas come from modernism, which was the birthplace of humanism, which was the idea that everybody is a good person. And if you are just given, like it's the Star Trek dream. I love Star Trek. I've seen every series, I've seen every episode, right? I love Star Trek. Star Trek is the modernist, humanist dream. It's if you just make everything equitable between people, everyone will be their perfect selves. right? Because every human being is so inherently good I'm not saying value. We do believe every human being has inherent dignity and value. We absolutely believe that. But the idea of modernism and humanism is that every human being is good. So if they're acting poorly, it's because, what did you say, Andrew? Environment. They're a product of their environment, right? It's not their own decisions. It's because they're a product of their environment. So this is what Marxism comes out of. Right? This is this is an underlying belief of Karl Marx that if we just throw off the capitalism and we revolt, and then we give people an opportunity to distribute the means of production equitably, then we'll live in a paradise. But it has the opposite effect. It leads to totalitarianism, to 100 million people being slaughtered in the 20th century with these communist regimes, right? So all of this works together. It all works together.
Does critical race theory come from this?
Yes. Yes, that's why it's called critical race theory. So it's racism through a critical theory lens. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I guess I don't understand that term critical race theory.
Yep.
Critical. Why is it?
Because the idea is we need to criticize society's infrastructure and institutions in order to facilitate political revolution. Okay. Other questions or thoughts on this one? Okay, next one. Intersectionality. We're continuing the thought trail. Okay. So in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw, she released a number of papers. Kimberly Crenshaw is a law professor. I think she's at UCLA right now. Law professor at UCLA that focuses on race and gender issues. Okay, she releases a number of academic papers in 1989 talking about this idea she has, this framework called intersectionality. Okay, so the framework it's a framework for how our identities, and we all have many identities, right? So you are a white woman, native born in the United States, right? You are a Christian, you're able-bodied, you're not disabled, right? You're able-bodied, you're heterosexual. We all have these identities, right? Framework for how our identities intersect to create layers of oppression or privilege in our lives. So again, it's the idea of inequity is a result of oppressor-oppression, okay? And so if you are having a rough shake, let's assess your social and cultural identities to see where these intersections of oppression are coming from, okay? What this looks like then is okay, so going back to you, being white is kind of the normative, powerful identity in this nation, according to intersectionality, right? Being woman is not. So you have one intersection of oppression. Being Christian is not that's an intersection of privilege, not oppression. Native born, privilege, not oppression. Heterosexual, because we live in a heteronormative society, a society that, at least up until 5 minutes ago, was predominantly thought of itself in a heterosexual way, like our culture naturally does, right? I just mean the effort. This is all interrelated, you guys. The effort to take LGBTQ, like we talked about, and make that normative in all areas of our society what is that doing? So this all goes back to critical theory again. We critically assess society. Okay, we'll do a quick case study. Okay, here we go. We're actually going to get into the nitty-gritty here. Trans people have high suicidality rates. Right? That is an outcome that is not equitable. It's a bad outcome, and it's focused around this group that identifies as trans. Right? Trans people have high suicidality rates. So the critical theorist asked this question: how are the institutions and assumptions in our society, which ones are oppressing this person to be suicidal? So they become identifying those systems of oppression. Heteronormativity, that's like a new word that came on the scene 5 minutes ago, right? Heteronormativity is this idea that our culture predominantly sees through the lens of heterosexual, binary, gendered relationships, right? So that heteronormative power structure is a form of oppression for the trans community, right? And the assumption then is that that's leading them to high suicidality rates. They will also point to something like Christianity. Christianity is an intersection not of oppression, but of oppressor, of privilege. Christianity, all these people that are saying that it's immoral to transition, right? So that is another institution in our nation that is leading to systemic oppression of the trans community, and the assumption is leading to their suicidality. So then what do they do then? What's the goal? What's the idea here? The idea is we need to overthrow the oppressors. So we need to remove the Christian narrative from culture, and we need to remove the heteronormative narrative from culture, so that these trans people feel included at every level, just as much as a heterosexual person would feel included. They feel that much included, so their suicidal ideation, their suicidality rates will go away. Did that make sense? That path that... I'm not saying do you agree with it, I'm saying did my explanation make sense? Brenda.
Okay, let's say eventually, we're like gone, and they are like the majority. Well, then it's like, then it flips. Then you're being oppressed. Like I feel like right now with the whole
Right.
racism too. Like now it just seems like it's like, right?
So, okay. So we'll go back to Robin DiAngelo for a second. Again, right, white fragility, okay? White fragility, Robin DiAngelo. And the reason I'm referencing this book is because this is like one of the main treatises on critical race theory right now, okay? She says this explicitly in the book. She says, it is not possible for a person of color to be racist. Why? Can you figure this one out? Why? Why is it not possible for a person of color to be racist? Even, and she acknowledges this, even if they hate white people, or if they are absolutely, they have prejudice and what was the D word that I used? Discriminatory acts toward white people. It's impossible for a person of color to be racist. She says this in her book. Why? Kate.
Possibly because I'll come back.
Missy. That's fine, Kate. No worries. Not quite, but I can see why you would go there. Yes, it's not the institutional norm. So because black people don't have the, according to them, institutionalized power structure behind them, racism can't occur with a black person. Because again, racism is not prejudice and discrimination. Racism is institutionalized system of oppression. And since the institutions supposedly favor white people, a black person could never be racist, even if they are discriminatory and prejudiced in all of their actions. This is critical theory, okay? I'm trying to help you understand this. This is critical theory. In general, intersectionality identifies those with the most minority identities as oppressed and those with the most majority identities as privileged. These social inequalities create interrelated systems of oppression and domination. So, going back to the trans thing again, right? So what would be actively fighting for justice in the trans community? It would be flying rainbow flags to say, you're included, we welcome you, we see you, you're here. It would be Disney trying to put an LGBTQ person into every show or movie that they produce. That's justice for the trans community that has high suicidality rates. Questions or thoughts on intersectionality? Well, let me ask you a question. When slavery was a reality in the United States, was that institutionalized racism? Yeah. So can racism be institutionalized? Yeah. For sure. When Jim Crow laws were in effect, or when segregation was the name of the game, right? Was that racism institutionalized in our society? Or through dominant cultural narratives, or through whatever? Yeah, it was. So can systems of oppression and domination occur through some of these sinful ideas? Of course they can. The question is, are they occurring? So, maybe I'll wait till next week and actually get the figures for you. I could probably just summarize it here. I might have the figures slightly wrong. I'll just talk in generalities. Trans high suicidality rates, okay? Many studies have been done, and they all show that trans people maintain high suicidality rates even after coming into affirmative communities. Many studies have been done that show that trans people, about 5 years after transition, become most suicidal about 5 years after transition. So then you have to ask the question, okay, well, I'm looking at the data. Does your assumption that trans people are suicidal because they aren't being affirmed, that's the assumption, they aren't being affirmed by institutions in society, is that assumption true? I think the data would say, no, it's not. And so then we have to question the narrative that, well, this is institutional injustice. This is cultural hegemony oppressing a people group. No, maybe there's a different issue going on with trans suicidality rates, than non-affirming culture. The problem is this, is that critical theorists don't believe there can be another answer. They don't believe that there can be another answer. The answer always lies in institutions. Right? Can the answer be institutional? Sure it can. And if we see data, if we see objective evidence that shows like there's institutionalized racism in this nation or something, well, we better get on that, right? But you can't argue with someone who says there's no other option. It's either institutional or it's institutional. So they see inequitable outcomes. They see high black male police imprisonments. And the assumption is automatically made. It doesn't matter what data is looked at. The assumption is automatically made. This is due to institutionalized racism. There isn't another option. Because I know that if everyone got a fair shake, they would all be happy, healthy, joyous, society-loving individuals. Okay. Questions or thoughts there? All right, so what is social justice? This is William H. Young. And this is an article, Academic Social Science and Social Justice. He defines it like this. While often being an amorphous term, social justice has evolved, that's important, to generally mean state redistribution of advantages and resources to disadvantaged groups to satisfy their rights to social and economic equality. Communal sharing by groups has replaced individual responsibility and reciprocity as the ethos of social science. Ultimately, social justice can only be realized through a command economy and totalitarian state, which is envisioned by the sustainability ideology to impose economic and social equity, considered in the academy to be synonymous with equality. Okay, it's a little academic, okay, so I'll just kind of break it down really quick, okay? What social justice has come to mean is distributive justice. So if there is inequity, which is, I said it's a buzzword and we'll talk about it in a second, equity has also changed meaning. Equity used to just mean fairness, right? Equality. Equity now refers specifically to outcomes. Specifically to outcomes. If we see inequity or uneven or imbalanced outcomes in people groups, then what must be is that institutional injustice is occurring that is oppressing them. And so therefore, we must redistribute wealth, opportunities, fill in the blank, resources, whatever, to these groups that are having inequitable outcomes. So this is like affirmative action. This is like, actually, you know what? We'll talk not about white people for a second. Let's talk about Asian people for a second. Harvard was recently being sued because they had too many Asian people in their institution. Now, what's Harvard's claim, right? Well, sorry, it was just the Asian people who had really good grades, really good test scores, did really well at our, on our assessments and all this kind of stuff. And so that's just how it panned out. They were the ones that were the best fit for our schools. Just happened to be that way, right? But that's inequitable. There needs to be an equitable number of blacks, Latinos, or Latinx, because you can't use a gendered a gendered noun anymore. So not Latino, it's Latinx, because Latino means male, right? Blacks, Latinx, white people, right? It's inequitable toward white people too. White people, all these inequities because Harvard has more Asian people than they should, is the claim. So they were sued recently over this. Sued. Because if you see an inequitable outcome, if you see a distribution that isn't equal, there's more Asians at Harvard, there's more black men in jail, there's more fill in the blank, right? Then it must be that institutionalized injustice has occurred, and therefore we must redistribute outcomes. So then you get quotas. Harvard, you have to accept 45 black people this upcoming year, right? Well, we only had 100 black people apply, and most of them didn't qualify. Doesn't matter. You have to accept 45 black people because that's what's equitable. This is called distributive justice, and this is what modern social justice is. Yes, Paul?
The federal law?
No. This was what was wanting to happen. This is what people wanted. I'm not saying it was commanded to them. This is what people wanted to happen. But like affirmative action, school quotas, all these things. This is modern social justice. Whole bunch of... Okay, that's a good question, actually. It's a great question, Christine. I'll tell you who has time to keep track of it. The government. And so then it's the government's job to make sure that everything is equitable between people. So listen to this again. We'll read the definition again. While often an amorphous term, social justice has evolved to generally mean state redistribution of advantages and resources to disadvantaged groups to satisfy their rights to social and economic equality. Communal sharing by group has replaced individual responsibility and reciprocity as the ethos of social science. Ultimately, social justice can only be realized through a command economy and totalitarian state, which is envisioned by the sustainability ideology to impose economic and social equity, considering the academy to be synonymous with equality. Okay, so it's the government. That's who has time to keep track of this all and enforce it. So we'll go into this then. Next slide, please.
Is that part of affirmative action then, or what law does that come under?
We're not, like, we're getting there. We're not quite there yet, but this is what's being rallied for, okay? The phrase social justice began to be used more frequently during industrialization. Social justice generally meant justice in society. And specifically, the reason it was called social justice, it was usually referred when talking about big cities. So during industrialization, you had a lot of problems like with factory workers working 14-hour days, 7-year-olds working 14-hour days, not having any kind of representation, not having any kind of voice, right? And so social justice was kind of this modernist term talking about justice in society, specifically in the big cities, right? That was kind of what it originally meant. 21st century social justice is also now known as critical social justice because it is rooted not in, modernist idea of social justice, but in critical theory. So the other term for modern day social justice is critical social justice, CSJ. And the proposed justice process is usually as follows. Number 1, identify disadvantaged groups. Number 2, assess group outcomes or equity, right? Assess group outcomes. Number 3, assign blame for disparate outcomes. 4, redistribute power and resources to redress grievances. Questions or thoughts?
Affirmative action, and that, like, basically being
Yes.
instead
Yep.
of your qualifications.
Yes.
Yeah, I like, I don't understand why you would want to.
So here's the idea behind it, okay? Here's the idea behind it. Yes, this individual of a minority group, say, it doesn't have to be race. It could be LGBT. It could be disabled, right? Disabled, like people who have mental disabilities, people who have physical disabilities. Ableism is a social justice kind of hot word right now. Ableism. Discrimination against people with disabilities, right? So say you're LGBT, say you have a disability or something. Okay, so the idea is, now with disability I can understand this, okay, but the idea is this person isn't responsible for their low qualifications. The reason they have low qualifications is because of the injustice of society. So even though their qualifications are low, you still need to hire them to have a percentage, an equitable representation in your workplace. No. Well, so then here, let me play devil's advocate for a second, right? Say that that's true. Say that the reason, okay, take LGBT people for a second, okay? Say that there was these institutionalized forces in our nation that kept LGBTQ people from success. Like truly systematized, we can objectively measure these things, and these are actually keeping LGBT people oppressed and down so that they can't get into college, they can't, they can only live in bad neighborhoods, they can only, fill in the blank, right? There really is something like that. Well, then it would be quite difficult for an LGBT person to break out of that system of oppression to exceed any higher in life, wouldn't it? Be very difficult. So because, for the critical theorist, that's the only option on the table. That if there's inequity, it has to be systemic oppression. That's what it has to be. There isn't another option. It has to be systemic oppression. So the fact that we see, we'll just keep on the LGBT, like say we see low LGBT representation among CEOs. This isn't real stuff. I'm just pretending, okay? Say that's what we see. Low LGBT representation among CEOs, okay? According to critical theorists or modern social justice, which is critical social justice, CSJ, okay, it has to be systemic oppression. Therefore, to give this LGBT person the movement that they deserve in society, because this was all oppressed upon them. It's not their own fault. To give them the vertical movement that they deserve in society, we're going to make sure that every Fortune 500 company has at least one LGBT person in a position of high authority. Okay. Now, that's the devil's advocate position, right? And you can at least kind of understand why people want this. Okay, even if you disagree with it, you can at least understand why people want this. And look, the reality is that there could be systemic oppression in this nation. I'm not saying that there isn't. But what I'm saying is that shouldn't, well, I'm making the claims before we look at the biblical data. Whatever, you guys already know my opinions on this, it's fine. What I'm saying is that you can't assume that every unequal outcome is due to systemic oppression. Like we talked about the trans suicidality rate. You're assuming, the assumption is just made. The reason trans people are suicidal is because of Christianity and heteronormative society. But we don't actually see that in the data. That actually is not what we see in the data. Doesn't matter. That's the only option on the table. Systemic injustice. There is also, you've noticed this. I know you've noticed this, okay? There has been a move away in areas of social justice. There's been a move away from actually talking about data to talking about narratives. The whole focus is share your story. Share your story of oppression. Share your story of how you were marginalized. Share your story about this. And it's been a move away from objective fact-checking to you feel hurt. Tell me that story. There we go. There, ding, ding, ding. That's evidence. That's evidence for systemic injustice. I'm not saying that systemic injustice can't exist. It has certainly existed in this nation. We just said slavery and Jim Crow and segregation. These are real instances of systemic injustice, systemic oppression. It can totally exist, for sure. But we got to look at the evidence. What does the evidence actually say? That's what we should be looking at, not listening to people's sob stories. Sorry, I don't want to be harsh or crass, but that doesn't lead to truth. That leads to victims talking about their sob stories. That's all that leads to. And certainly as Christians, and we'll get into the biblical data, I promise, certainly as Christians, we cannot make the assumption that this is purely systemic. Our assumption as Christians would more readily default to this was a result of personal choice, unless proven otherwise. Yep. Yeah, Missy. Yeah. Missy. Yep.
And so who are we going to, because I mean, if you look at it,
Yeah.
the government pays to have food data skewed so we think that this is safe when it's not safe.
Yeah.
Like, it is both sides, and I don't know who I would trust
Yep.
to see those data points.
Yeah, it's a good. Yeah.
In making their
Absolutely.
So without
Yep.
a balance of some stories and to back up the data that
Yeah.
people are seeing,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think there is so much disinformation in our nation. It is hard to sift through how skewed is this. And I wouldn't disagree with you at all. Yeah, what were you going to say, Christine? Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
Never been a concern among themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. No, I agree. And I don't think like this way of viewing reality is not a Christian way of viewing reality. Like, I want to be clear about that. But like I said, that isn't to then just go through this and go, oh, that means systemic injustices don't exist, right? That's just liberal BS. Like, They obviously just don't exist then, and I can plug my ears and move on. We can't go that route either. Like, we have to be people who are going after truth. Going after truth. We're going to do, okay, because I totally just went on and on and on. And we didn't even get to the biblical data. I'm really glad I've turned this into only 2 weeks. Let's turn just to one. We'll do all of it later, but let's just turn just to one tonight. Isaiah 59. And it worked out just fine because I actually didn't finish the slideshow. So it was going to be just working from the notes tonight. But Isaiah 59, 14 through 15. Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away. For truth has stumbled in the public squares, and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. This is just a statement in Isaiah rebuking the nation, saying, because truth has departed from the public square, justice is impossible. Justice is impossible. That truth is a prerequisite of justice. And it also causes that the one who, verse 15, truth is lacking, he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. It makes the one who turns from evil the one who people go out and try to destroy. Right? Because truth has left the public square. Truth is a prerequisite of biblical justice. Truth is a prerequisite of biblical justice. I want to read to Zechariah 8, 16 through 17. Go to Malachi and take a left. If I can do that, hold on. Here we go. Zechariah 8, 16, 17. These are the things that you shall do. Speak the truth to one another. Render in your gates judgments that are true and make for peace. Do not devise evil in your hearts against one another, and love no false oath. For all these things I hate, declares the Lord. Just reinforcing again that idea that truth is a prerequisite for justice, is a prerequisite for right judgments. So a worldview that says, this is the only answer, it can be none other. And here are the stories and narratives to support my claim. That is not a pursuit of truth. But could it be that others who are standing against that are also skewing the data and trying to say, no, see, blah, 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 but internally are deceitful schemers. They're all that kind of, for sure. And so we absolutely need to lean on the Lord. We need to hear His wisdom, His truth. I don't think we can become, I would caution strongly against just complete skepticism. I would caution strongly against just complete skepticism, because you can't even live in a society like that. Like that, a society like that can't exist. That's a society that has come to that point is a society that doesn't exist anymore. So I would caution against complete skepticism, but I would say in all of these things, regardless of whether it's what seems cold and calculated or whether it's something that pulls at your heartstrings, I would say in all these things, show me the evidence. Show me the evidence. Hey, if systemic racism is a real thing, let's fight it. We're Christians. Let's not let slavery, Jim Crow, segregation continue. If systemic racism is a real thing, let's fight it. Show me the evidence, though. Because I'll end with this one, okay? Exodus 23, 1 through 3. You shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. What is that saying? That's saying that don't side with the mob. Mob justice is not biblical justice. Don't side with the mob. In fact, if we learn anything throughout history, the mob is usually the one that's wrong. Unfortunately, we live in a democracy. No. Don't side with the mob. That's what that says. And it says, one more time. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. Why do they have to say that? Well, because the poor are the oppressed, right? The poor are the ones that have the sob story, that pull at your heartstrings. They're the ones that have the narrative as to why they are this way. No, don't show partiality to a poor man. You pursue truth. You give justice to the oppressed, but you do not give false justice to those who are not oppressed. Proverbs 18:17. This is on the same one. Okay. Where am I here? Proverbs 18:17. The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. Ain't that the truth? Yeah. Think about your own life. Think about your friends. First friend that gets to you, they tell you their story. The injustice of it all, the anger rises in you. Oh, gosh, I can't believe that person did that to you, right? And then you go talk to the other person. Oh, hold on here. We got to get to the bottom of this. We got to get to what's actually true. Proverbs 18:17, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. The Bible is not interested, God is not interested in siding with the poor, the black, the white, the able-bodied, the disabled-bodied, the whatever. He's not interested in siding with anyone. God is not a respecter of persons. He shows no partiality, period. That's what that scripture means, by the way. That in his judgment, he shows no partiality. All he's interested is in truth and what people deserve. When it comes to justice, mercy is different. Mercy and justice are not the same thing, and you can't conflate them. You will get very confused if you think mercy is a part of justice. Oh gosh, we're just going through the biblical data now, aren't we? It's 8:24. We're still good. Okay, the Hebrew word for justice is mishpat. The Greek word for justice is krisis. They both mean the same thing, ensuring people receive what they deserve. One second, Paul. Ensuring people that receive what they deserve. This is called retributive justice, and it's actually essential to God's nature. It's who he is. That he gives people what they deserve by nature. That is the biblical definition of justice. And then all of our scriptures here reinforce that idea.
That makes more sense.
Yeah, right. It makes more sense. God ensures. And are there times when people, like the orphan, right? The orphan. Well, the orphan, guess what? By their dignity, by their humanity, they deserved to have a family. But they didn't. Injustice was done to them. So God tells the church, care for the orphans. Be a family for the ones who don't have it, because that's actually what they deserve. They deserve to have a family. Every human person deserves to have a family, right? But God doesn't show partiality to anyone. He doesn't show partiality. He doesn't get brought into sob stories. He doesn't prefer one group over the other just because they made their case first or because there was some historic injustice done to them or whatever. God doesn't show partiality. He's interested in truth and giving people what they deserve. Now, mercy is also part of who God is, but that is not justice. Mercy is giving people something better than what they deserve. And that isn't justice, that's just mercy. So as Christians, we are called to be merciful and compassionate. And that we'll talk about that next week when we talk about how to love well, like we've been asking the question. We are called to be merciful and compassionate. We are called to be people who give people not something better than what they deserve, right? But mercy isn't justice. I want to be clear about that. When we're talking about society and justice, we are not talking about mercy. And that needs to be clear. Those are not same, this is not part of the same thing. Paul.
So if you serve on the jury, never serve on the jury.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the judge will orient you to.
Mm-hmm.
We don't care about what the person looks like.
Yep.
You're making your decision
Based on facts and evidence. Yep. Yep. Not whether they're seem to be angry person or whether they're sobbing their face off, right? None of that matters. What matters about justice is the facts and evidence of the case and ensuring that that person gets what they deserve, good or bad. Right? That is called retributive justice. It's who God is. Which is why Jesus had to die. But that's not part of our topic. That's not part of our topic in this class. So, questions or thoughts kind of at the end here? We got a couple more minutes, yeah.
So we talked about social research institution in Frankfurt.
Yeah.
Is that like the leading institution in all these?
Today? I don't think so. No, that was where this think tank began. But you can do gender studies, feminist studies, critical studies, all over the place. Race studies. I mean, like the social. This is what you're going to get inundated with if you go to school for social work. I'm sad Paul wasn't here tonight because Paul's going to school for social work. So I'm like, there's Paul. Yeah. Kate. I mean, yeah, you did go to school for social work. That's right. Yeah.
So, I have a question then about justice as far as you break the law.
Yeah.
The law says you're penalty to go to jail or
Yeah.
whatever. So,
So what if they're innocent or something, huh? Or, I don't know, that's not.
because we're supposed to show mercy, but the law, like, you broke the law, you need to serve.
Yeah. So.
Penalty, how does that work in with, like,
Yeah. So let's say a couple things on that, okay? Christians are not supposed to participate in vigilante justice. Like you aren't allowed to make a judgment without a higher authority, right? So you can't bring justice into your own hands. This is why Paul says in Romans 12, he says, don't repay anyone evil for evil, but leave it to the wrath of God. Because the Lord says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And he is specifically talking about Judgment Day. And how if that person doesn't repent, they're going to get everything they deserve. You leave it up to God, you don't take it into your own hands. But God has Romans 13 then to follow up with that, Romans 12, then Romans 13 to follow up with that. God has placed government in the earth. That government is a gift from God. Doesn't mean all governments are great. It doesn't even mean all governments are good. It just means that the concept of government is a gift that has been given by God, and that governors and judges are meant to reflect Him in the world. Whether they do that or not is not, whether they do that or not is not the question. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to reflect God in the earth. And he says that the governor does not bear the sword in vain, but is an instrument of wrath against the ungodly. So okay. As a Christian, say I was like a 12-year-old girl and my uncle raped me. As a Christian, what do I do in that situation? I forgive, don't I? And I say to that person, you don't owe a debt to me. I release you of your debt. You don't owe me. I do not withhold. I don't hold this against you in the sense of I'm going to exact a debt from you, right? However, if that uncle is before a judge, say it's a Christian judge. Say it's a Christian judge, right? So what Jesus is saying to that little girl is, sweetie, you have to forgive, even though what he did to you was unthinkable. As my daughter, I'm commanding you to forgive, right? What Jesus is saying to that judge who is in a position of authority that bears the sword as an instrument of God's wrath are two different things. Even if the judge is a Christian, the judge's job is to look at that uncle and say, you get what you deserve, and I'm going to take you away from society so that you don't keep doing this to little girls. Okay? What was your question?
I don't even remember.
Yeah. Okay, good. Good.
I just still have to serve there.
Yep. Yep. Now, I will say this, and this isn't to freak you out. I actually want to give you a little encouragement, okay? And we'll end here, because it's now 8:30. If something in this nation is going to lead to real, I don't mean like someone made fun of me on social media, or like, Facebook blocked my video or something, okay? But if something is actually going to lead to real government persecution of Christianity, it will be this. Critical theory. If anything is going to actually lead to real government persecution of Christianity, it will be critical theory. Because the idea is Christianity is a system of oppression. In fact, I am the most oppressive person in this room. Well, there's a couple of us here, a few of us here. White, male, cisgendered. Remember we talked about what that means? It means that my gender identity lines up with my biology. White, male, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christian. That's the most oppressive person in the United States, according to intersectionality. Okay? Christianity is viewed as a system of oppression in critical theory, in critical studies. It will be it would come about by government redistribution of power and resources away from Christians toward the marginalized groups, which and I'm not saying I'm not really worried about this, because as a Christian I don't need to make a power play. We're called to be meek in the world. Guess what? The church thrives under persecution. That's all fine. It's good. I don't need to fight I don't need to make a big hullabaloo and fight for my religious liberty or whatever, because guess what? I'm a meek Christian who who I know my relationship with Jesus would only go up if I started experiencing real persecution, right? That's what his church has always done. So I'm not worried about this. But if anything does actually go toward real governmental persecution of Christianity, it'll stem from critical theory. We're going to talk about this next week, but I was just talking with the Lord, and I was like, God, how would we ever untangle the web of just deception and confusion in this nation? Because Satan is so clever. He co-opts the word justice, which is essential to who God is. And then he has society aim it at the church and say, because you are about retributive justice, in other words, people get what they deserve, because that is the God you serve, you are the ones who are unjust. Satan is so clever. Satan is so clever. All right? That aim could very well lead to real persecution in this nation. But here's the thing. First of all, persecution only makes us stronger, not weaker. Secondly, I was talking to the Lord about this because I was a little frustrated and overwhelmed. And I'm like, God, how would we ever disciple this nation and undo, years and years and years and years and years of this deception and these interlocking webs of ideas that are so damaging to society? How would we ever do that, God? This is a hopeless endeavor. He just said, David, you just keep the main thing, preach my gospel and love people well. You don't need to take every person through this class or whatever. You don't have to do it. You just preach the gospel and love people well. You stand up for righteousness in the face of persecution. You go low, humble. You stay humble. You love. You pursue true justice. You're meek. And guess what? That's how Christianity overthrew Rome. I say overthrow, but in a real sense we did. We overthrew the most powerful empire to have ever existed up until that point by love and humility and being persecuted. So I know it's possible, you guys, and it doesn't require a PhD to walk people through this stuff. You just have to give them Jesus. Amen? Stand up. Lord, we bless them. Bless us, bless us, bless us. Encourage us, God. Give us strength. Let us go out from here in great vitality in your spirit. And I pray, God, that somehow we would be able to wrap up next week talking about how to be real agents of justice and doing the rest of the biblical data and figuring out this whole thing. All right. Love you guys. Thanks for coming out.